The Guns on Pegs podcast is brought to you by iTap Group. Hello, and welcome to the Guns on Pegs podcast. My name is George Brown, and as always, joining me at the microphones is Chris Horn. Chris, what's new with you?
Not enough, if I'm honest. You know, if you shoot in August and then don't shoot in September and your next day is in October, it's a really bad idea.
It's really tough for those poor souls who have to shoot in August, isn't it? I feel so sorry for you.
The problem is, George, most people who shoot in August shoot quite a lot in September, and I'm just not one of those people.
No grey partridge invitations then?
No, except hold on, I might have a bone to pick with you here, because I think we got invited to go beating on a grey partridge day, didn't we?
Correction, I got invited.
Well, I did as well, but I've just not been as brutal as you have followed up, and, you know.
Well, sadly, I don't know.
When are you going?
I don't know if I can make it. It's a Monday in a couple of weeks' time. I need to work out some logistics. But I'll tell you what, if I can't go, you can have my flag. How about that?
Piss off. I'll get my own invites. Okay, thank you. What have you been up to?
Well, I've had an eventful few days. I wrote a little while ago on Scribehound about my love of cooking things with fire in excessively elaborate ways. And this weekend, I think, if I can ever top it, I'll be really happy. We cooked a whole roebuck in the asado cross sort of Argentinian style, where you kind of crucify the thing in front of a fire. And I had a very nice time. I basically spent the best part of 12 hours sitting next to a fire, poking it with a stick while the roebuck gently sizzled.
And how did it taste? It
tasted great. I think, if I'm honest, there's some improvements that can be made if I'm ever going to do it again. Some stuff worked really well. The marinade worked really well. Brining it and basting it and all this sort of stuff worked really well. The skill is making sure that the bigger bits, the haunches and whatnot, are sufficiently cooked whilst not absolutely cremating the sort of smaller bits like the back straps and that sort of thing.
I can imagine.
So it's a bit of a balancing act, and I think you kind of have to decide early on which is most important and then run with it. So because we had a lot of people to feed, I decided it was more important to get the big bits done right. So the back straps were not particularly nice. But the bits that were cooked the way I wanted them to be cooked were really nice. And we served them kind of in, a sort of flatbread with rice and guacamole and all that kind of stuff. And it was really delicious. But mostly it's about the fun of doing something that crazy.
And like anything like that, your first time is always going to be pretty average.
The main objective was not to poison anyone, set fire to anything, or, any of that sort of thing, of the whole thing to come crashing down off its supports or anything like that. So that avoided all of that. Nobody was poisoned. Everybody said it was nice. Whether it was or not is, objective reality.
Well, on the basis that you shared it far and wide online, I think that's really what you were doing it for, and it was 10 out of 10 for that.
Oh, it was all for the gram, for sure. No, I loved it. It was really good fun.
Very good.
But yeah, so you've had your first shoot day, but we've got our first shoot day on the farm in a couple of weeks' time. And then at the end of this month, Chris, we've got the most important shoot day of the whole season.
Podcast shoot day. Conversation on the chat is picking up.
It is.
It's getting quite exciting.
It seems to be mostly about golf at the moment.
No, that's because we're extending it. There's people staying 2 nights, and now we've managed to chuck in a golf day before. I think it's a good way of doing it. It's all about the trip, isn't it?
Do you know, I haven't struck a golf ball in anger on a golf course since I was 18 years old. But in the evening, when we were having this roebuck, we'd got a few golf balls up there, and I was hitting them pretty clean. I'm thinking maybe I might borrow a set of clubs and come and join you.
Well, yeah, clubs. That's very, very generous of you. I was going to say, if you want to dust your golf bats off, then you're welcome to join us the day before.
Is it a golf bat, golf wand?
Any other pod listeners who fancy a round of golf finishing up in the 19th? I think it's a good way to start shoot day in October when the course will probably be underwater. Anyway,
enough about us. You probably better introduce our guest, who's been very patient.
He has. Our guest today is a game farmer, which is very apt for our pheasant episode, kicking off the start of the season. From a long line of game farmers as well. He's chairman of the Game Farmers Association, and he has been for 4 years of a standard 3-year term. So he's obviously very good at that job. He's a regular contributor to Guns on Pegs' sister platform, Shoot Hub, where he shares his tips and the ups and downs of a game farmer's life. He's also joining a very exclusive club. Very few people in this club who've appeared on the podcast more than once. He was on, Dark Days, our special bird flu episode we did way back in, well, you did actually, George. I wasn't on that one with you, but it was in June 22. That feels like a lifetime ago, and it is only just over 2 years, which is something we'll come back to. So anyway, put down your bag of chick crumbs, step away from the incubator, and put your hands together for George Davis. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Hi, Chris, George.
It's nice to be chatting to you in better circumstances than when you were on this pod last.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Those were frightening days. We just didn't know where it was going to end. It just manifested so quickly. It was a job to keep up with it all.
I've just registered my chickens at home with the Home Office, with the Home Office or whoever it is, DEFRA. So I've told them I've got lots of chickens. So I'm making sure that doesn't happen again. But George, I mean, you must be pretty relaxed now. All the birds have gone off to their new homes, and they're all in the pen and the wood, and so you're feet up, cocktail in hand most of the time, I expect.
Well, actually, I'm anticipating some drier weather, so we can hopefully move our breeding stock over to the wintering pens. Something we've been trying to do for the last 2 weeks, but it's just been, well, we've had one day we had 3 inches of rain here. It's just been continual rain for the last 2 weeks. It's been a nightmare. Until that's done, then I might start to relax, because we've got to finish off just taking down the last of the rearing field, and we've still got to get some grass seed in. So yeah, time's ticking.
So if you were wondering whether game farmers are real farmers, the answer is yes, because whenever I speak to George, he tells me that the weather's terrible.
Yeah. Great say.
I was chatty about putting grass seed down at the weekend. It's clock's ticking on that one in quite a big way, isn't it?
I have done it about the 20th of October, so I think I've got 3 weeks to get it in.
Noted. I shall follow suit then. Thank you.
Well, since we're all here, we might as well have a drink. George, what's that you're drinking?
I'm just finishing off a mug of tea because it is so wet, and tea is a great stimulator when you're out in the day, on the day in the farm, and on a very wet day like today. It's good to have a cup of tea, but not just any tea. We have tea shipped over from Ireland. It's called Barry's tea, and I do recommend it. This isn't an advert, by the way.
Hold on, Barry's tea from Ireland.
Barry's tea,
I've heard of Barry's tea. I think Barry's is to Ireland what Yorkshire tea is to England.
Absolutely, yeah, it's on a par. Yeah, definitely. Entering into the spirit of things, I have also brought with me a glass of King's Ginger, which is also very good on a cold day.
Very true. Yeah. Now, given the serendipity of that, I'm going to go to you, Chris. Now, what have you got?
Seamless link right there. Yeah. Turns out Barry's Tea's website has music playing in the background as well, which really confused me. Because this is a normal Wednesday in the office, I've gone to the office cupboard, which contains lots of different drinks. One of those drinks is King's Ginger, and I have mixed it with, obviously, the only thing you can mix it with, which is chocomel. So I think genuinely for the first time ever, I'm having chocomel and King's Ginger.
For the uninitiated, what is chocomel?
It's basically chocolate milk, I think, isn't it?
Well, you're the one drinking it.
Well, it tastes like chocolate milk. It's just it's chocolate milk and King's Ginger. And it's actually, I mean, it's a winter warmer because King's Ginger is a winter warmer, as you rightly pointed out. Chocolate milk, I don't think there's a time of year that's specific for, and it tastes interesting. But, you know, if you don't try, you never find the next big winning drink. So,
will you be having it again?
It depends what card you put out the pack, doesn't it?
Is it something that you're going to make people on the podcast shoot day drink as some sort of punishment?
Well, if we delay putting this out, what I can do is say that it's amazing, serve it, and then we'll find out that way. But on the basis that this probably goes out for the shoot day, I think everyone's going to say no.
Yeah, I think I'll stick to straight, personally.
I think, the makers of King's Ginger will be horrified that I've mixed it with chocolate. But this is how good drinks are created, I think. You just try stuff like this.
Well, I mean, it reminds me of our previous guest, Rich Prideaux, and his various experiments. His, I think, have got stronger country credentials than your mass-produced chocolate milk. But
it's very Christmassy because the ginger is quite Christmassy and it's chocolate.
Yeah, I can see that.
Do you know what? That last sip's warmed on me. I reckon by the end of this, I'm going to quite enjoy it. Anyway, what are you drinking, George?
Well, I've got a proper pint, which is a rarity. I often have beers, but rarely a pint of them. And I've got a very nice Old Golden Hen, which is a relative of Old Speckled Hen, obviously, but it's a golden ale. And it's, I'm sure I've had something from these guys before, although I couldn't tell you which beer it was exactly. But it's, for an ale, it's very fizzy, which I hadn't anticipated or remembered, one or the other.
You're not a fan of that?
No,
actually,
I actually really
you're
like
a
it because I'm generally a lager drinker, and it's just sort of like a slightly meatier. Is that? I don't think that's quite the right word, but sort of a lager with a bit more oomph. So I really like it. I'm really enjoying it.
So basically, a pale ale then, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, it's in that neck of the woods, but just with that sort of effervescence that one would associate with lager.
Well, I'm not jealous of you.
I'm not jealous of you. This episode of the Guns on Pegs podcast is sponsored by Scribehound.
You'll have heard us talking about Scribehound a lot, but you might be asking yourself, what on earth is it? And why do you keep going on about it?
Yeah, so Scribehound is not just any other business. It's a sister business to Guns on Pegs, where you can feed your passion for the countryside with exclusivity, insight, and expertise specifically designed for the countryside community.
So that's 30 of the best countryside writers, including lots of former podcast guests, people like Ian Coghill, Patrick Galbraith, Guy Adams, Charlie Jacoby, Adam Henson, David Gower, and many others, producing exclusive columns every day on the topics that really matter to them.
Yeah, this is proper country people writing about proper country stuff, openly, honestly, with style, wit, and I think no small amount of wisdom. There's farming, fishing, shooting, plus a whole load of other stuff too.
So we're currently offering a 1-month free trial, so you can see for yourself whether it's worth the hard-earned pounds in your pocket. All you need to do is download the app on the app stores or visit scribehound.com and you can start your free trial today to see whether you like it.
It's time to turn to the mailbox, and this is a section, George, that we call Whose Bird Is It Anyway? It's where we ask our listeners to send in their shooting quandaries and queries and dilemmas, and we do our level best to help them out. This episode's Whose Bird Is It Anyway submission comes from somebody who emailed pod@gunsonpegs.com, and I have decided to name Scooby. Scooby has said, "My Springer Spaniel Blaze is 10 years old, super fit, has a great nose and not a grey hair to be seen, but is deaf as a post. Last season, I started using a plastic dog whistle, which worked perfectly, but this season, no joy. I've tried different pitches and even a football ref's whistle. Sadly, no response at all. He's been my constant shooting companion for 9 years, travelling all over the country from the foreshore to the deepest valleys, and has been much admired. Now I have the heart-rending decision as to what to do with him. Do I take him on shoot days and keep him on a lead, only letting him off when there's an easy retrieve, and hopefully not the scent of a runner? Hope that he'll start paying me and my hand signals more attention when there are so many distractions, risk upsetting others because my dog seems out of control, or betray him and upset my family by leaving him at home. The ultimate betrayal would be getting another dog. The beaters and pickers up tell me I'm too young at 63 to get a Labrador, but recreating spaniel perfection seems daunting. Any advice you can give about this most impossible situation would be most welcome."
Oh dear, that's mixed with all sorts of emotions.
It's tough, isn't it? I mean, first, just to bring it back, there is a ray of hope, which is that at 63, there would be a reasonable chance that he'd be the one who's gone deaf.
True.
Can we start with the end? George Davis, shall I just pick you up on the 63 point? What do you reckon? would you say to someone if they said to you, I'm 63, I won't get a Labrador?
I had a Labrador at 21, so I don't have a problem with Labradors at all.
But he's saying his friends have said you're too
old, too young.
I don't get it.
Too young at 63.
Yeah, I don't get it.
He's implying Labrador's an older person's dog.
I see. Sorry.
Or possibly that spaniels are a young man's dog because you need energy to keep up with them.
Exactly.
And you only get a Labrador when you can no longer keep up with a spaniel.
Of course, it's lost on me, that joke. I didn't realise it was a joke. Anyway, I've taken it badly because I have a Labrador. Fine. Anyway, back to the point in hand.
So, George, you had a Labrador. What have you got dogs at the minute?
I have a dog. It is a Teckle. Are you familiar with Teckles?
Well, yes, my parents have Dachshunds, which are of a similar temperament.
Yes, it barks a lot. So,
yes.
Unfortunately, I mean, he would be great out on a day, but I'm not brave enough to take him. So on the few days that I do go, I confess I do leave him behind. So I do feel guilty with that. So yeah, I don't know what to advise this chap. He's obviously very emotional about his dog, but if you're on a really good day, you don't want to spoil it for everyone else, do you?
It's interesting that last year it was fine, and then literally all of a sudden this year, no good at all. I mean, that's a really tough moment in any life with your dog when it's your companion on the shoot day.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of those things I think you've got to prepare yourself for when they're like 2, isn't it? It's going to happen one day.
I wonder if there's a practical solution, though, because have you seen those the silent dog whistles, which are so high-pitched that only a dog can hear them? The little sort of thin metal ones. So it could be worth having a go with one of them and see if that works. I mean, it's only going to be a temporary solution, I suggest, but
definitely. And the football ref's whistle is going to be much, much lower. That's like a very low pitch versus a normal dog whistle. I agree. That's a good suggestion, just in case you might get another 6 months. But I mean, if he's deaf as a post, then what can you do? I mean, you want to take him out, don't you? But he's going to be going stir crazy if he's on the lead the whole time, watching all the other dogs.
I don't know. I mean, at 10, that's quite old for a working gun. I mean, they're certainly slowing down at that age. And spaniels live life at 1,000,000 miles an hour, so it might be that he's sort of content to come in. And if he is a perfect spaniel, as is implied, maybe he'd be quite happy to sit there on the peg and just pick the ones from around the peg. If you can run fast enough, you can go with him.
If you take your dog in this scenario, and you then said this story to the others on the shoot, you're getting a lot of leeway, aren't you?
Yeah.
So that would be my first bit of advice. Don't just shoulder this yourself. Say, look, you won't believe it, but this is a scenario. I'm going to give it my best shot and all that sort of stuff. And you probably get a year of getting away with that for a bit. And then next year, you won't be able to get away with that anymore.
Yeah.
It is interesting now. I've been out on a day shooting and someone's turned up with headphones for his dog. As he's sat on the peg, the dog's got headphones as well.
Well, like ear defenders.
Never seen it before, but we're wearing them. Why shouldn't they be wearing them?
Yeah.
Now there's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting point. That is presumably to prevent shooter's ear, but in the dog.
Yeah.
So a quick Google confirms to me that you can actually get hearing aids for dogs the other way around to amplify, obviously.
Well, there you go. That's the solution.
There you go. Yeah.
Are they Bluetooth? Can they also get Radio 4?
The first thing is it says is most dogs do not tolerate them very well, unsurprisingly.
It's like those hoods, isn't it? We put the hood on when they've got something on their ear or something. They've got to prevent them from scratching.
The cone of shame.
Hmm.
I mean, the cone of shame presumably acts like a sort of amplifier as well.
If it's looking in the wrong way.
It's like a satellite dish.
I've never thought about this. I mean, obviously dogs have a little bit of ear protection because they've got an ear that has a little flap over it.
Spaniels do anyway.
Who knew we'd be talking about dog ear flaps?
Well, we've done nearly 100 episodes, Chris. We had to lose steam eventually.
Right. First of all, so with your next dog, with his next dog, he has to put ear protection on the dog from a young age, so that this doesn't happen in the future. Next bit of advice: take him out, sew the sow the seed to everyone, share the story, get yourself another year.
Yeah.
You're saying, George, high pitch whistle, try that.
Yep.
The silent whistle. I'm also going to say take him anyway.
Yeah, I think so. I think, they just love being out, and, he might be quite keen to work. And if there's, a very easy retrieve, go for it, or get him on one of those retractable leads so he can't go too far. Just on those easy ones, you can get quite long retractable leads.
Oh yeah, like those leads that people who walk their dogs over the moors say, "Oh, my dog's on a lead," and it's like 100 yards away from it.
Yeah,
they are deadly. I've got to tell you about a story. I was delivering ducks probably about 10 years ago, and it was not too far from a footpath. And this lady was just walking past us on the footpath, and she had a fairly large dog with one of those retractable leads. And she saw what we were doing, that we were releasing these ducks, and the dog just flew. And so she tried to press the button to stop it, but it actually got tangled round her thumb.
Oh,
the dog carried on going, and the thumb came off.
Oh my God.
She was yelling and screaming. We went flying over there to find out what was going on. So we had to rescue the dog first of all, and then we were looking around the stubble for this bit of thumb of hers. She was, and trying to stop her bleeding out. So, what seemed quite a mundane afternoon turned into an emergency rescue.
Okay, so I'm retracting that, like the lead. I'm retracting the statement. Don't get a retractable lead. That sounds like a very bad idea.
Yeah, not a retractable lead, just one of those big long ones.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I know the ones, like a sort of lunge rein.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I don't really like them generally because people basically have them for dogs they can't control. I think. Yeah. I'm going to get told off, but that's what I think.
I like the idea of having them on the lead, but also going with them on the retrieve. Have you come across canicross?
I've heard about it. Like, attach them to your waist.
It's jogging with a dog. And yeah, you are attached to the dog at all times. So if the dog goes, you have to speed up too.
I was out at the weekend, one child walking, one child in a pram, dog attached to me /child/pram because child wants to walk dog and so on. And this woman came past me with an Alsatian attached to her waist. She was in her full lycra. Anyway, the Alsatian decided it didn't like something. This woman nearly ended up in the woods about 30 yards to the right. And you just thought at that point, what is she doing? It's a death wish. If your dog's not that well trained.
Or too big.
Exactly. Like if you're a little girl and you've got a really big dog.
Good. Well, I think there's some useful advice there, along with some maybe less helpful stuff. Do let us know what you decide, Scooby.
But definitely needs to get himself another dog, and obviously because he's got a spaniel, he needs to get a Labrador.
Disagree. Spaniel getting a Labrador is admitting defeat.
Let's not start on this one. Right, we've got our first MacPodcast suggestion, George.
We have. Do you want to just remind everyone what a MacPodcast is? Can you remember?
Just about. So a MacPodcast is fur, feather, and fin, as in the McNab, but in 3 different continents. So you've got to get exotic. Each one of them has to be in a different continent. And we put each other on the spot at the game fair and came up with some stuff. Actually, it was really fun thinking about it. And we've had one in from Justin. He says, "Good afternoon. Following on from your Game Fair special podcast, I have a slight twist on the MacPod to suggest. You'll see what I mean. For the fin, I'd like to catch a salmon from a raft in Canada. I've never been to Canada, and I think it would be an extraordinary way to travel and fish. A friend did it a number of years ago and still talks about it. For the feathered leg of the MacPodcast, I'd like to shoot a ptarmigan with a 2.2 rifle on skis in the Nordics."
Whoa. I didn't know ptarmigans could ski.
This was the twist he was talking about. I've always wanted to shoot a ptarmigan in the Highlands, but never had the chance, although I've seen them walking on the hills.
But not skiing.
I can't get it out of my head. Okay. As a keen rifle shot, I think the ultimate test... Right. As a keen rifle shot, I think the ultimate test would be whether you can ski on cross-country skis to find one and then shoot a ptarmigan. I mean, standing up on cross-country skis is hard enough. Finally, for the fur element, I'd like to photograph a tiger in India from an elephant howdah. A tiger hunt in the days of the Raj would have been quite a spectacle and an experience, but this is the PC version. I've been lucky enough to see and photograph elephant, leopard, lion, cheetah, but never a tiger. This would have to be the bucket list finish. P.S. Just doing a proper McNab on one Highland estate in one day remains the ultimate ambition. Except that sounds a lot harder to do what you've just suggested.
Well, I think I'm right in saying that Frank has had a go at this cross-country skiing, hunting in the Scandies somewhere.
Yes.
But I can't remember what he was...
But they were after Capercaillie.
Were they?
Which with a rifle is what people do. A ptarmigan is smaller than a grouse, a red grouse.
Tricky target then.
I'm still picturing a ptarmigan skiing along, just, with this little sort of bobble hat.
I'm interested in this salmon from a raft. I assume he's talking about a drift boat, which they use quite a lot in North America. It's sort of a rib, and they kind of row downstream. Well, they don't row, but they're sort of steered downstream, and you fish from the boat.
I was going to say, surely you need someone else with oars.
Yeah, so typically you'd have a guide with you doing this, or a buddy doing the steering. I associate that mostly with trout fishing or steelheading rather than salmon fishing, but I don't suppose there's any reason that you couldn't salmon fish. It's the use of the word raft I'm interested in, because those are very definitely boats, not rafts. So maybe I'm missing something.
I don't know, George, are you getting anything from this?
Well, I'm just wondering, is he talking Atlantic or is he talking Pacific? Is he talking like an Atlantic salmon, or is he talking like is it Chinook?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different Pacific salmon species, which I assume that you get all up that Canadian Pacific coastline. But the Atlantic salmon fishing on the Atlantic coast of Canada is supposed to be really good as well. I mean, yeah, the opportunity to fish in Canada would be an incredible one, and salmon are amazing no matter which species or which ocean they live in. So, I mean, that's a great way to kick it off.
It's something my father did for a number of years, actually. He would fly out to Halifax and then catch a boat plane up to St. Paul's, and he'd spend a week up there. And I think the worst part of it was the flies, the little black flies. But yeah, very, very remote. Yeah.
So obviously the highlight of this is the idea of him being out photographing a tiger from an elephant.
Yeah. I mean, that would be incredible, wouldn't it?
I've really not got a lot of experience to add at this point.
I've ridden a camel.
So have I. Too many knees.
Yeah, it'd be quite something. I don't know if this is something that's particularly tricky.
Well, so if it's anything, I know a few people who've done kind of riding safaris, and they say that because you're on the horse, the wildlife sort of ignores you a bit. It just goes, oh, look, a horse, rather than, oh, shit, a person. I wonder if the same is true of tigers and elephants, that they go, oh, look, an elephant, and then you can therefore get closer to the tiger.
Depends on your aftershave, I suppose.
Oh, the big cat.
I think actually the whole reason he sent this message in was so that he could say, just doing a proper McNab on a Highland estate. Actually, he's saying it's his ultimate ambition, so it's not actually saying he's out there doing it at the moment.
Well, I mean, the nice thing about the MacPodcast is that because of the 3 continents bit, they're all impossible, more or less.
You mean to do it in a day?
Well, even in 3 days, it would be a challenge.
Hold on. If you are going to do 3 continents in a day...
You could probably just about manage Europe, Asia, and Africa if you were somewhere in the Middle East and had a very fast plane.
Yes, that's exactly where you'd have to do it. Right, 3 continents in one day, a realistic one. pod@gunsonpegs.com, send them in.
I really like that one, though. I really want to hear some more of them. Right, so Scooby, Justin, and now you, George, are the newest members of the Most Noble Order of the Garters and will very soon be in receipt of a set of the much-coveted Guns on Pegs podcast shooting sock garters. If you too have got a shooting confession, quandary, or a query that you'd like us and our guests to help you with, or if you'd like to share an unpopular opinion or a MacPodcast selection, and you would like a set of garters, drop us an email to pod@gunsonpegs.com.
And at this point, I must give a shout out to Chocomel and King's Ginger, which is getting better by the minute.
You're having a tremendous time, are you?
Topping up mine.
It's actually really good. Yeah.
Cheers.
I don't think it's lifting the veil too much to say we're recording this on the 2nd of October, the day after the start of the pheasant season. So sort of in honour of that, we're sort of thinking of this as the pheasant episode. So I'm going to go right back to the very basics. Can you explain what is a pheasant? Where do they come from originally? How do they behave? What are their preferred habitats, diet, all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, they come from Asia, and that's obviously a very large place. So they were brought over by the Romans, allegedly. It's said that some species tend to prefer woodlands and others sort of marshy, open ground. And yeah, they eat anything from insects to seeds. They'll venture around and find what they can.
Because I think we need to be clear that there's quite a big family of birds that are the pheasant family, and that includes like peacocks and all sorts of other things, doesn't it? And then you also have pheasants, of which there are a huge number of strains. And I think I'm right in saying that some strains are sort of created by the blending of different species of pheasant. Is that right? The crossbreeding of different species of pheasant?
So, yeah, I mean, obviously you've got the fancy ones, you've got the goldens and silvers and so on. But when it comes to shooting, predominantly sort of 100 odd years ago, it was sort of blacknecks, Mongolians, Chinese and Japanese greens. And you'd occasionally see the sort of melanistic mutants.
Are they all separate species of pheasant, or are they subspecies of the pheasant species? Or
No, I think they're classified as separate. But what we've seen more recently is you've got the Michigan bluebacks and you've got the Kansas. You might see a pattern here, American naming, but they're sort of basically a Chinese. And then I'd say even more recently, we've got the Pheasant, which in my mind is very similar to the Mongolian to look at. But of course, Pheasant is the Polish word for pheasant.
yes, it's very similar to the Slovak one. I had a beer on the podcast once, which was called Zlatý Bažant, which was a Slovak beer, golden pheasant.
So anyway, they seem to be the most ubiquitous pheasant at the moment. They're sort of good all-rounder.
And have those all been bred in recent times then for something? I mean, probably for shooting.
So yeah, I think over the years people have sort of got various strains. I think in the it was in the sort of in the 80s we were looking at Fenland birds, which is a tiny little strain that, similar size to a Kansas that allegedly flew very well. I think when people talk about flying, though, it's not so much about the strength of flying; it's about the want to get up and go vertical. Because when you, I know a lot of we used to rear blacknecks for many, many years, and a lot of people would say, "Oh, they don't fly," but they do, and in fact, they're very strong birds, and they will fly into a wind, whereas some of the smaller birds don't. So it is very much horses for courses, but I do think that people read too much into different breeds. I think personally people should stick to a breed that they like and learn how to manage that breed rather than chopping and changing because they think this one does as it says on the tin, because a wild bird does what it wants.
Very true.
That's such good advice that you hear so many shoots or people involved in managing shoots talking about, oh, we got this one this year and this one this year. And I don't know, when you hear that, it does ring a few alarm bells because they are hoping, aren't they?
You're just chasing then.
But would you suggest different strains for different parts of the country or different terrains? So if you are in a flat bit of the country, presumably you do want a strain that is more inclined to go up rather than along.
Yeah, again, I think people read too much into this. Okay, there is a tendency, but there are other things that need to be taken into consideration. And we've sold blacknecks onto an estate in Lincolnshire, and literally you can see for sort of 20 miles. He sent me a video of these blacknecks going, skyrocketing, because they've got nowhere else to go. Many times you go onto a shoot and they're not, there's so many different things. There is just so many different things. I think, speaking to some of the vets, I think when it comes to flightability, if they've got birds that are not flying well, then look at them and see, because quite often there's some sort of health issue underlying, like
Yeah.
worms,
Yeah.
or they're perhaps not feeding, a great pellet. Sometimes people just feed wheat, but do they actually check the protein levels of the wheat each year? It varies so much. So, and if you're pushing these birds again and again within 1 week, they need the energy.
Yeah, for sure.
So there's just so many things behind it all. And then the other thing is, if it's not so much if you're pushing them off the top of a hill, it's where they're going to go. So, if the pen's lower down, they're going to drift downwards. But you want to be sending them up and beyond. So you've got to think like a pheasant.
There's so many interesting bits of advice in there, because I think when you stand on the peg, if all you ever do is that side of the shoot, as it were, you're not going to know a huge amount about this. But from my experience, when you see different shoots run in different ways, I think probably the starkest difference for a lot of different shoots is the number of times the birds are pushed, and the tendency for what's going to happen thereafter. Obviously, there is some learning going on, but I think the most impressive shoots for me have been the ones that, they're often quite private shoots where they'll put down enough birds, show a decent day or whatever, but then only shoot it very infrequently. And when you stand there, you think, gosh, there's something just a little bit different here. Like, it just feels more different to a shoot that would shoot more often, because it needs to, balance the books a bit more than the one that doesn't. I think that just, therefore, something totally different for the gun.
One interesting thing, in 2022, when we couldn't get hold of partridge, people couldn't manage to get the partridge, so they just had pheasant. There was some feedback that the pheasants were flying better, and they were wondering that previously, where the partridge were flying within the same drives, that the pheasants were actually coming down to the partridge level.
Fascinating.
Very well. We actually last year at home decided that we were going to stop trying to include, for example, pheasants in what's really a partridge drive, and vice versa, and found that the results were, just because of the way you drive them and the direction and that where you have the guns and that sort of thing, it made a huge difference. So it might be that people are just setting up differently as well. Although I can completely believe that if you've got partridges scudding through low, that the pheasant's going to look at that and go, well, that looks like a good plan, rather than wasting the energy getting high.
So what was the strain of pheasant that was being put down, say, 40, 50 years ago across the UK?
I would say mainly the blacknecks. We were doing blacknecks. We were doing a few Japanese greens, and the Mongolian as well. Yeah.
So when was there a big shift?
This is interesting because this is where the French came in, really, I think. Which
as breeders,
yeah,
and supplying,
because and breeding goes back a very, very long way. Next year, we will have been breeding pheasants here for 150 years, and we started in 1875. We started rearing for somebody else who was doing it 100 years before us. So it goes back a very, very long way.
Goodness. And that's all for shooting?
Yeah. But of course, in those days, it was the gamekeepers that were doing the rearing. So the game farmers, in fact, like the Game Farmers Association that started up in 1907, was predominantly game farmers selling eggs. So they would be breeders rather than rearers. So rearing poults on game farms was not really big until the 80s.
That's so interesting. So until the 80s, then it was a question of the game farmers reared the eggs, and then each shoot would have its own hatching and rearing operation.
So no, in those days it was broody hens. In the 70s, you had. So we would drive. My father would drive around the country and pick up as many broody hens as as he could find, and they would sit on the eggs. So this was pre-incubators. So they would hatch them off. Now this we obviously did some on our farm, but the keepers would buy eggs from us, and they would have broody hens on their site. So you'd see some photographs of keepers with a long line of broody hen coops. But the key thing that changed it all, I think there's two key things that really changed shooting to what it is today. One is the invention of the compound pellet. And I don't know when that was, but I suspect it would have been 70s, 80s time. Because previous to that, and I remember it, our rearing fields years ago, the keepers would have a giant pot which has got a fire underneath it, and he would put biscuit meal in there and bone meal and the odd rabbit and pigeon and pheasant eggs, and they would make up the food. And I seem to remember it was something like it would take one keeper all day long to make the food for 1,000 birds.
Crikey.
That's how limiting it was. And that's why it was so expensive. Yeah.
God, that's amazing. And so you said there were two things. So one's the feed.
Yes. The other thing is the use of cover crops, because before that, shooting was predominantly in sort of wooded areas, and very much in this part of the world where I am now, in sort of Buckinghamshire, Hertfordshire, Berkshire way. But go down to Devon and Somerset. No, you need some cover crops because there's not so many woods down there.
Yeah.
It was a game changer, quite literally.
And so that then, okay, so people become more efficient. They then obviously start trying, like any human, they spend their life trying to perfect things. And that's when the strains start getting adjusted to suit different scenarios, better flying birds, all that sort of stuff.
So what was happening in the UK at the time, many game farms were practicing catching up birds at the end of the season. And this led to, it's believed, people catching up the birds that were perhaps slightly wounded or didn't fly very well. They weren't shot because they didn't fly very well. And they were breeding from these birds again year after year. And this had the net result of the birds just weren't flying so well. And this is something that a few game farmers like ourselves kept our own stock. And we dealt with the French and the Italians years ago. We would get fresh blood in, and they would from us as well. But the game farmers in France recognised this and started shipping chicks over here. And it was significantly better quality bird because of the breeding. Because in France, they don't have the temptation that we do over here, because they don't have as many shoots that would have the birds at the end of the season. Because for me, it takes to rear a bird and take it all the way through to March. That bird, before it started to lay, is about £15 a bird. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of investment in overwintering.
Yeah.
But for somebody, who wanted to catch up instead, well, they could be buying them anything from sort of £3 to maybe £8 a bird. So a fraction of the amount.
Breeding from the worst stock.
Yeah, I mean, that's subjective. Obviously, people who have practiced this on a large scale, and even now. So I would argue, I say that I call them second-hand stock.
Yeah. I mean, interesting. So on the breeding, I mean, obviously there's a lot of natural variation in pheasants. There's these different strains. There's some smaller birds, some bigger birds. And, when you see one of the smaller strains next to, a big ringneck or a blackneck, you do think, crikey, they're almost like two different beasts. So they're quite malleable in terms of breeding. I'm sure I remember reading somewhere that a breeder in America, just to prove what could be done, had managed to breed a pheasant the size of a turkey. Someone was telling me that. Have you heard this, or have I made it up or imagined it?
I think they do like a meat stock. So, and I think they're white. I haven't actually seen them myself, but yeah, I have heard of them. But interestingly, we had a Trusted Game conference earlier this year, back in February, and we had an American game farmer over giving a speech, and he was talking about breeding. And I said to him that we'd been trying to perfect the ideal pheasant over here for years, but the customer wants a big poult when it's delivered, that's a small bird when it's flying, but when it lands, it's big again for the game dealer. And he said he hasn't got the answer either.
So there's no such thing as the perfect pheasant.
But on top of that, they want a tame bird that doesn't wander anywhere, but a wild bird that flies when it needs to.
Yes.
So it's a big ask.
I mean, you've just touched upon a point that is quite close to my heart on this, which is there has been actually, I haven't got any stats to hand, although I know we've got them somewhere, but there has been an increase in the number of Kansas being put down. Would that be fair to say over the last 10, 15 years?
Yes. It has been a trend, yeah. Yeah, other trends like the fenbirds sort of phased out, but yeah, it has been, yeah.
And the problem with a Kansas bird is that it's very hard for the game dealer processor to make that bird work.
It really is, yeah.
And I know that a number of game dealers have basically said no to Kansas birds because we just can't get them out to the table. So there's this massive issue in there, which is, it comes from we're putting this down because we want to have a shoot. But obviously, if there is no market for the thing at the end of it because you're putting the wrong strain down, then you got a problem.
This is just one of the frustrations of the shooting sector because we are so fragmented and not connected. One part of us is making somebody else's part a much harder job. So I've often said we need to communicate better. But of course, we have to prioritize, where do our priorities lay?
To what extent do your customers say to you, I want strain X or Y? And to what extent do you say to them, well, I think you should have this strain? How do you make the decision as to what to rear in the first place?
So we stick to one breed. I mean, years ago, we used to have 5 or 6 different breeds. About 2016, in the UK, we had a big problem with mycoplasma. And unfortunately, we had some of our breeding stock contaminated from wild birds flying in. We had a closed flock, but we didn't have nets over the top at the time, but we do now and I have done ever since. So we had to source, this is my own personal experience, we had to source birds coming in. So I then made the decision to source some from Poland. And we've kept that stock ever since. And I'm blood testing on a regular basis, doing PCRs on a regular basis, just to monitor the health status. So we're completely closed flock now. And so I do bring in new blood, but it comes in as chicks on the rearing field so we can isolate it. And we will blood test them before they come into our own stock. So I have a very strict regime here. So I can't bend to the customer's demands, so I have to then persuade him.
You have to bend the customer to you. And I think you've touched on something there that I wanted to ask about, because obviously we've talked a bit about the history of breeding and rearing pheasants and the changes that have happened from, broody hens and mixing up your own feed and all that kind of stuff. But I'm guessing that the blood testing and the sort of thing that you were just talking about there is a comparatively new phenomenon.
Yes, it is, yeah. And obviously, I think people are a bit more aware of it now because of COVID. Nobody really knew what PCR was. But basically, you're testing for any genetic material. So if we take a swab, send that in, and if it's like a snapshot photograph, and if there is any genetic material of that disease, we can pick it up. And then we do the blood tests, which test for the sort of antibodies in the blood, which will give you a broader spectrum picture. So having both gives you a better idea. It's not 100%, but by doing it over a number of years, it gives you more peace of mind.
Yeah. And what about the future then? I mean, I know in other areas of farming, of breeding animals, genetics and DNA is a big thing. Can you see that is game farming too small for that to become a thing?
Yeah, again, this is really interesting. So the French are ahead of us on this as well. They have very good genetics. They have isolated game farms that just breed for the breeding stock. So you've got the same stock genetics each year. So you've got continuity. Whereas over here, we would, like ourselves, we keep the same birds, but occasionally we will add something else to dilute it. So it's much easier done on a very large scale. Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah. What about other changes? I mean, there's all sorts of different. I'm thinking now about kind of the way that poultry are reared. There's some very high tech systems in the sort of poultry world. Are there any bits and pieces of that you look at and think, "Oh, we could make use of that technology"?
Yeah,
or
we're constantly learning from the poultry world, and it is fascinating what they do. They're even sexing birds in the incubator now. That's no good for us, but I keep saying this in my articles. Although we learn so much and have gained so much from the poultry sector, we are doing two completely different jobs. So within 4 weeks or so, they're putting a chick into a shed, and the unit is completely sealed and contained and environmentally controlled. Now, what we're trying to do in a similar sort of time is get that chick outside and hardened off as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
So their focus is on daily live weight gains and food conversions. Ours is about getting very good feathering and hardening them off.
Is that what makes it more of a term farming as opposed to just breeding? Because in theory, you should be a grain breeders association, really, in a way.
So there's actually not that many game breeders in this country.
What's the difference?
Majority would be rearing. So they would be buying chicks in from hatcheries, and they would just be focused on the rearing side of things.
And so that, I suppose, is farming in that sense. That's definitely not breeding.
Well, breeding is part of a farming activity, but unfortunately, I think it's unfortunate anyway. I'm not too sure. We fall in the category of non-agriculture in some ways, but in other ways we do. So we have to obviously sign on to the poultry register, but they don't categorise us in many ways as an agricultural activity, because we're rearing birds for a leisure activity.
This is probably more of a Shoot Hub podcast conversation, but I know there's a lot of people listen to this who have or belong to a small sort of DIY syndicate and that sort of thing. In the chicken world, the poultry register has been, sort of hobby keepers like me, we've all been told to register our birds. But I think people but the number used to be if you had more than 50. So if you had half a dozen chickens in the back garden, that was fine. But now every single chicken has to be registered. Presumably the same is also true of shoots, that they should all be registering their birds. And
as there's not many shoots that ever put down less than 50,
it
was always the case that they needed to do this. But it was, to be honest, I think it was very vague. Why didn't they call it the Poultry and Game Register? Why did they just keep it as poultry? And to criticise it, it wasn't, it wasn't promoted enough, perhaps. But anyway, we have been helping to promote this as much as possible, and it is, working with APHA and DEFRA, we've learned that it is fundamental to opening the sites up as quickly as possible, because when they have these zones, the last thing they have to do before they open the zones up is to go round everyone in that area and check to see, whether they have a problem. Now, they were having people going knocking on doors to do this because they didn't know where every bird was. So with the poultry register, that equips them better.
It makes sense. So I mean, we've talked a lot about the one side of shooting. We need to get onto the other side of it for a second, because there's no way you spend all your time just doing the farming side, George, is there?
No. I mean, the breeding side does take up more than you think. But by the time we're sort of wrapped up, it's sort of getting into November. And then again, sort of January, February time.
You're getting invites from customers is where I was going to say.
Oh, yeah. I do get out to see a few. Yeah. And it's good to see your birds as well.
Is that's how you describe it, rather than shoot them?
Well, try to.
Exactly. So George, the way that we finish these pods off, as you're probably familiar with, is with a segment we call Desert Island Shooting. The situation is this: the extinction level event asteroid hits tomorrow. However, your affairs are in order, your loved ones and enemies are reconciled, dogs fed, tomatoes watered. your last day shooting ever begins how? What are you going to do?
Do you know, I thought this was a really easy one. And then I started thinking about it. Then I kind of thought, right, okay, I think I know what I'm going to put. And then I listened to Tim Bonner, and he said virtually the same as I was. He said, you've got to go over the bridge to Wales and on the woodcock and snipe. For around 20 years, we would go. My father and our syndicate would go down to Wales on the Pembrokeshire coast, and we had some great times down there. But it always ended up around a pond around 4:45. And you're waiting for the ducks to come in. And that was exhilarating, absolutely exhilarating. But I think Tim's had that one, so I don't think I can claim that.
Well, I think you could probably go with Tim if you wanted.
Well, there's a thought, yeah. But I just wondered, I have often wondered about going a little bit further afield, further west. My wife comes from Ireland. And I'd like to go and see how the Irish do it.
Very nice. Wildfowling again, or?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. There's so many things that I do enjoy about shooting, but I do sometimes feel that sometimes driven shooting can be fairly contrived on some shoots. And I do like the anticipation. And while you're stood on your peg, and I think this is, part of the ingredient of a good day is the long wait. And wondering whether it's going to come over you or the gun to the left or right of you, and you might not get a shot on one drive, and then suddenly you do. But in that time, when you're waiting, you're surrounded by the countryside, and particularly if you're down in a part of the countryside that's new to you, you're sort of getting connected with your surroundings. And I've been down in Wales, and you stood on, very near to so near to the coast that you can hear the sea crashing in the background. And again, being out with good mates, and you end up in the pub afterwards having a beer, having that connection with friends as well. So I think it's those two key ingredients.
Yeah,
so it doesn't really matter where you go shooting. It's having those two key ingredients.
I completely agree. I think that the that moment, and it might be just a few moments if you're on a driven day where everything's run like clockwork, or it could be several hours if you're out duck flighting or decoying pigeons or whatever. Those moments where there is that sort of calmness and quiet gives you a real opportunity to sort of be part of the landscape rather than just in it.
Yeah, and I think that's key to what we do. And when we're trying to defend what we do, it is a very difficult thing to do. But when I see people like jogging through a park and they've got their headphones on, I feel like they're not connected with the countryside. They don't realise what's going on around them. And again, when you're walking through the town and there's hundreds of people walking past you and you're ignoring everyone, it just seems so wrong. And I think out in the country, the more rural you get, the more connection we have. And I think people are looking for that now.
It's so true. When you're out with a totally unorganized pigeon controlled exercise, you on your own, last minute, you just feel so in connection with what's going on around you because you haven't had a chance to plan it. You've really got to think on your feet. You're monitoring absolutely everything that's going on. And you end up obviously with a couple max, right? But there's something about that scenario which is so enjoyable. And
well, particularly with those ones those things that you do in the evening, duck flights, roost shooting, that sort of thing, you end up kind of
wired, absolutely wired. When you come back, you notice everything. And you go for a walk with your family, and you say, "Oh, there's a deer over there," and you're pointing everything out to them. And they're going, "What the hell are you on about?" You are so connected. You see everything.
And it's funny though, if you walk out your back door with a dog and you see pigeons, you're like, I don't know. I always find it odd because when you go out with a gun, you'll never see any pigeons, right?
Yeah.
But that scenario of you're spotting absolutely everything. You know exactly what's gone, what's flown over there, what's moved this way, what's putting stuff out of that wood over there, and it's just you are really connected.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's a lovely suggestion, George. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's been great fun.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks, George.
And I hope that when people listen to this and then they have their first day out with their syndicate or whatever in a few weeks' time, they think about some of the things, hopefully they've learned some stuff about pheasants that they didn't previously know, and they think about some of it and where it's all come from.
Yeah, one key thing is it's taken us a year to get it there.
Exactly. Well, George, thank you so much again.
Great. Thank you very much. Enjoyed it a lot.
Cheers, George.
Before we go, all that remains for me to say is that there's a final reminder that you can get your hands on a pair of the very exclusive Guns on Pegs podcast shooting sock garters by sending us your shooting dilemmas for us to resolve, or by sharing your unpopular opinions, your forgotten drives, or your MacPod suggestions. Drop us an email to pod@gunsonpegs.com, and if we read it out in the next episode or any future episodes, we will send you some garters. We will be back in a couple of weeks' time, but until then, thanks very much for listening, and goodbye.
I learnt a thing or two.